Welcome back to the Wolf of Property and Casualty. I'm your host, Derek Lasniak, with over 15 years of commercial broking experience focused on the middle market, upper middle market, and national account space. The Wolf of Property Casualty is a practitioner-led podcast designed for brokers, buyers, and carriers. No bullshit. Not here to sell anything. Straight talk. Going to do a series that we haven't done in a while because I haven't seen anything that caught my attention, but this one has hit me square in the face. A little series we call Claiming the News. Claiming the News is where we look at claims that are active in the marketplace, talk about the coverage implications, and talk about how I would be talking about these things or thinking about them. You can't go much farther right now in the news for anything insurance related or anything kind of in the food manufacturing without this Taylor Farms incident. I listened to a really good 20-minute episode on the Wall Street Journal podcast today that talks about it. But to offer a little bit of the details, apparently people are shitting their brains out and having diarrhea, and it's been linked to lettuce. Taylor Farms is not your average lettuce supplier. Taylor Farms has 20,000 employees operating in what they call the Salad Bowl of California, which is one of the valleys down there. They operate farms there. They operate farms in Mexico. They have 20,000 employees and $4 billion in revenue. They're providing produce at a massive level. They're selling to people like Yum Brands, which owns Taco Bell. They're one of the largest producers of produce in the country. They're making salad kits, etc. And so I can't remember the exact type of bacteria that we got going on. I keep wanting to say Cryptosporidium, but I think the corresponding results are the same. I think it causes immense diarrhea. It's not necessarily going to take any lives, but diarrhea can, for the wrong individual, can reach levels of dehydration that can result in hospitalization. But I think what's really interesting about this is the fact pattern. And the fact pattern got me thinking about insurance. So on July 17th, Taylor Farms, their Mexico division, starts a voluntary recall. I'm going to talk about coverage shares along the way. When I say voluntary recall, that means that there's not a government body, regulatory body. And that's really important for you brokers out there and those who are in food manufacturing. A government body is going to be what triggers your product recall or other types of policies. So there's a difference between voluntary, which you're doing because out of good faith, you think there's a threat of imminent bodily injury or property damage. And then there is a government entity that is telling you your shit's fucked up. We need to have a recall. So on July 17th, Taylor Farms, the Mexico division, runs a voluntary recall for Cyclospora outbreak. On the 18th of July, the FDA confirms that they now have a formal recall notice. The FDA confirms that it's now a formal recall notice on the 18th or 19th. So it turns Taylor's voluntary recall into a formal regulated mandated recall. And the reason I bring that up is it's not as common, but if you're dealing with a product recall policy. Now, keep in mind, Taylor Farms has $4 billion. They probably have a self-insured retention of $10 million, and they have a captive set up for their recall. They're an AN customer out in California. Who knows? But let's just think about this problem. This problem raises a lot of concerns that if you are in any food manufacturing or distribution, or if you have a recall policy, the fact pattern is still important. Issuing a voluntary recall, you have to believe that you have the credible damage to cause bodily injury or property damage. Taylor Farms issued a voluntary recall. Now a regulatory body, now every single recall policy is going to include, if a regulatory body like the FDA or the USDA says that you have a class 1, class 2, class 3 recall, every insurance policy I've ever read on the recall side is going to be triggered. If you voluntarily do it, make sure that you have coverage for what the voluntary components are. That's not always going to be the case. So by the 19th of July, the FDA tells Taylor Farms that they have a positive test for Cyclospora sample and that the recall has been formalized. Then a day later, the FDA says that was a false positive. I called the scientist / product recall expert today, and I said, how do you get a false positive? The false positive more than likely means that they had a positive test. In order to verify that you have a positive test, you have to take the same conditions, start over from scratch, and create another positive test. So it doesn't mean that the test was wrong. It means that they couldn't recreate the conditions in which to enact a second positive test. That's kind of the details, doesn't really matter. But the FDA says, hey, we're going to walk it back. We had a false positive. Taylor Farms comes out and says the FDA apologized to us, but they continue to do their voluntary recall. They continue to broaden it. They continue to pull product out of certain markets, including the Taco Bell lettuce, which was sold by Taylor Farms. The things that I really think about when it comes to this claim, again, not necessarily for Taylor Farms at this scale, but for anybody who's in the food distribution or anybody who has a product recall policy, always be clear about what your voluntary versus non-voluntary, because the timing matters. When you're up against the wire and you're trying to pull product out of the marketplace, you're going to want to do it with speed. And those expenses are going to be paid for by you as an insured, and then you're hoping to be reimbursed. Anytime in my career that you've showed up with a stack of bills to the insurance company, it's always nervous. I'm pretty confident I have coverage. I did what I thought was best and prudent to minimize the loss, and I spent this money. Now you got to go to Mr. Insurance Company and say, here's all my expenses. And the insurance company hasn't paid a dime yet. They're reimbursing you. And whenever you're working in a reimbursement policy on expenses, that's where insurance sometimes gets a bad name, and rightfully so, because that's when the insurance carrier says, it wasn't there at the time, but that expense seems excessive. That seems too expensive. Did you really have to spend that? So if you're acting out of necessity and you have a voluntary trigger in your policy, be thoughtful, be mindful of that. Make sure that you're doing the right things. And no carte blanche, if you have any regulatory body, anytime you have a class recall, your policy is going to be busted wide open no matter what. Some interesting things that also play into a part, and this is not a commercial for product recall, but it pretty much should be. I spoke with an expert in this space, and he was telling me that even if it's unclear if there's a recall or not a recall, and it appears that Taylor Farms is kind of latching on to what the FDA said about a false positive. Here's my opinion. I think Taylor Farms knows that they had a bad batch of lettuce that has this bacteria, and they were doing a voluntary recall. And when the FDA turned it into a formal recall, it made huge news. And now, even though they probably know that the lettuce is contaminated, since the FDA has come out and said, look, we can't recreate the conditions, it's a false positive, Taylor Farms, instead of just saying it doesn't matter, we're recalling it all, because that's the right thing to do, because of their size and scale and because of how many headlines this is making, they're latching onto that. They're saying, yeah, it's not us. Maybe it's somebody else. They're pointing the blame. And perhaps in their insurance policy, pointing the blame, if they say it wasn't us, might eliminate coverage. Or perhaps they have voluntary coverage within their policy, which allows them to collect for what they believe to be a threat. But if they believe that they have tainted product and they're spending money to pull it off the shelves, and then in the public, they're saying, yeah, FDA, you apologize to us because it's not our fault. That's managing your reputation on one side and actually the loss on the other. I think that's what makes this really interesting, this back and forth between the regulators and the at-fault party. But some other things to think about, and the recall expert I spoke to today, he was suggesting that the coverage that's in your policy that you typically have for full limits, adverse media coverage, regardless at this point of whether there's a recall or not, or it's their product or not, even if it comes out that their lettuce is fine, the negative adverse media coverage that is built into the policy that I've never used before on all the recall claims, that alone has been triggered because of the bad press. So let's just say that their product isn't tainted, but because of all the media attention, Taylor Farms has to pull product anyway. He believes that the policy limit will be paid out on the adverse media regardless. So now it doesn't even matter if there's a recall, voluntary or not, because this adverse publicity, adverse media coverage, which typically is going to be tied to the full policy limit, that becomes a trigger. Meaning if you have such detrimental media coverage that the product might as well be tainted, has to be destroyed out of an abundance of caution, we'll pay it as if there was a recall. The last piece that I want to talk about is the upstream and downstream business income impacts are going to be huge. I talked to another broker today who was telling me that they do a ton of policy work for the largest franchisors of Yum Brands, aka Taco Bell, meaning they put together foodborne illness type policies, which are typically in Lloyd's syndicates. And the largest fast food chains or franchisors buy a type policy. It's a foodborne illness policy in Lloyd's. So they're maybe buying, let's say they had 200 Taco Bells, they're maybe buying a $10 million. Well, they're going to blow through that $10 million limit because Taco Bell is all over the news is causing people to shit their brains out from bad lettuce. Think about what Taco Bell is going to lose in terms of net income over a month span, the month of July, as a result of nobody wanting to go to Taco Bell because of all the things you see online. They're going to blow through that $10 million limit. But product recall, again, pays for third-party business income. It's another one of those policies like cyber liability where there's components that are third-party and first-party. And I've seen recall policies pay for defense. I've seen recall policies pay for third-party loss of income, meaning Taco Bell sues Taylor Farms and says, as a result of your product, sales and in-store traffic is down 50% in the month of July for every Taco Bell. That it will be picked up by the recall policy. But outside of the expenses that they have incurred to pull product voluntarily, otherwise, or due to adverse media, they now have an income loss to one of the largest fast food brands in the country. Like any claim we've talked about in claiming the nudes, like any claim, there's nuances, there's layers. Brokers out there, use these examples to make yourself be more educated. And buyers, think about your business. And last thing for brokers, these are the examples where you can sound like you really have your shit together when talking to your customers. Hey, Mr. Customer, I know it's not your space. I know you're a contractor, but have you heard about this Taco Bell thing? You know what's really funny about that is it's got all these nuances that for an insurance guy like me is really interesting. Let me just tell you about it for 5 minutes in case you're interested. Now you're demonstrating that you have an active interest in the business of insurance, not just their business.